back to the 7th Symposium on Integrative Conservation. My name is Bruno Biali, and I'm a second-year PhD student in Integrative Conservation and Anthropology. SIC is organized and hosted by the graduate students of the Integrative Conservation Program at the University of Georgia. We hope that you have enjoyed engaging with our students and their research throughout the presentation sessions yesterday and earlier today. This afternoon, we're honored to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Eduardo Brondizio, Distinguished Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Center for the Analysis of Socio-Ecological Landscapes at Indiana University, Bloomington. Dr. Brondizio also holds appointments in the Department of Geography, the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Native Studies Program, and the Food Studies Program at Indiana University. In Brazil, Dr. Brondizio holds an external professorship with the Environment and Society Program at the University of Campinas. Dr. Brondizio takes an interdisciplinary and problem-oriented approach to the study of rural and urban populations and landscapes in the Amazon. As part of his research program, Dr. Brondizio has extensively addressed the interactions of smallholder farmers and rural households in the Amazon, with commodity markets, development programs and policies, social movements, and climate change. He strives to maintain a field-based, comparative, and longitudinal research program that combines ethnography, survey, institutional analysis, geospatial methods, ecological assessments, and historical investigation. Several publications and research projects demonstrate Dr. Brondizio's collaborations with scholars and students in anthropology and across the social and natural sciences, the humanities, and with local collaborators. Dr. Brondizio has served on numerous international scientific and editorial boards across the Americas, Europe, and Asia, and has held leading roles in global environmental assessments and sustainability initiatives. He served as co-chair of the Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBS. He's also the editor-in-chief of the journal Global Environmental Change, an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as a foreign member of the French Academy of Agriculture. This afternoon, Dr. Brondizio will present reflections on the opportunities and challenges of place-based sustainability initiatives in the Brazilian Amazon in light of development inequalities, global markets, and climate change. These are local initiatives in rural areas pursuing changes in productive systems, governance arrangements, value aggregation, and access to markets, with the goals of improving living standards and environmental sustainability. The presentation examines challenges and opportunities for local initiatives at the intersection of historical and current trends in economic development and policies. After Dr. Brondizio's talk, there will be a question and answer section moderated by Sydney Sigerman, and Sydney will go over the structure of the Q&A at that time. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Brondizio. Dr. Brondizio, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bruno, for such a kind introduction. Thank you so much. Well, first, congratulations to you all on this 10th anniversary of this amazing conference. I was looking into the program, super impressed with the diversity and the range, which I think really speaks itself for the kind of communities that you have in Georgia and the opportunity to work together across such a diverse group of scholars that are part of this program. Let me also say that the Department of Anthropology in Georgia is one of my favorite ones. I really admired my colleagues there, admired the focus and history of the department, and I'm really glad to see many colleagues and collaborators also listed here as participants. Let me thank Jeffrey Beauvais for his invitation and very nice exchange. I also want to congratulate all the organizers. I know that in this kinds of events, there are lots of people organizing and contributing. I want to extend my Congratulations to all of you, but not least also to Katie Foster and Corey Navis, who I understand are, dedicated themselves a lot for this to come together, and to Alec, the IT person who makes sure that we stay here on track. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. In particular, the 10th anniversary of this amazing program. I think Bruno already gave a summary of what I want to talk today. I want to be informal. I try to strip some of the too conceptual parts of it. I hope you enjoy. And what I'm trying to do here, as I've been trying to do in this kinds of presentation, is actually reflect on my own kinds of challenges and what I think is a very dissonant reality that we're living in. And on my side, working at a global level, doing long-term global assessments and working in the Amazon, you are all the time in between the most conflicting time that I can imagine. So, when working at a global level and working the global assessment, as I'm going to tell you, it just, the messages there are very sobering. When you look at the trends and the trajectories at the global level and where we are going in terms of scenarios, as I'll mention briefly, it puts us in a situation of, almost losing hope in the sense of the forces and the structures that have to be mobilized, to address the kinds of issues that we're addressing. So at the same time, perhaps I don't remember another time where there has been so much positive and forward-looking conversations. You talk about transformative change, you talk about the intersection or how climate change, social inequality, biodiversity issues are starting to come together and be addressed together. New forms of governance arrangements that are emerging, and I don't think, at least looking in the Amazon, I don't remember a time and elsewhere where there has been so many initiatives at all levels that people are engaged on in trying to confront those issues. And at the same time, we live at the time where denialism, fake news, conspiracy theory, dismantling of environmental governance and environmental structures, and of course, erosion of democracy, it's living side by side with the hopes and the ideas and all the motivations that we have to move forward. So it's a time of great dissonance. And what I think, it tends to happen, at least in some of these forums, is that I think we forget to look beyond the surface and to look of what people are doing and understand and sort of trying to make sense of the potential of local initiatives and initiatives at all levels to start to revert the trends that we have. So, and that's what I want to do today. I want to give an overview of some of the most worrying trends that we have identified in a very general way in this presentation at the global level. And then from there, set the stage, to look at initiatives that are happening elsewhere, and then in particular in the Amazon through this project that is an ongoing project that we're doing called Agents, which has been, I think, one of my biggest source of hope in recent time, from seeing what we see going on the ground. So I'll start with an overview of global trends, as I said, and some of very, very synthetic results of the global assessment. The global assessment, for those who don't know, was an assessment done by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service, IPBES, and is intended to be the most comprehensive of its kind that is intergovernmental, meaning this was requested and approved by 132 countries and negotiated by 132 countries. And what we did with hundreds of people, we assessed the state of the planet and our relationship to the planet for the past 50 years or longer, depending on the topic. And when we look at the outcomes of those trajectories, this is the kind of picture that we have today. Basically we have completely reconfigured this planet, and we are continuing on a track, to continue to do so in coming years. So, 75% of the land significantly affected today, even the oceans, a very small portion of the ocean actually that has no direct anthropogenic influence, wetlands almost disappearing, and undercurrent trajectories, we are bumping those numbers up to the 90% of significant change that we do. Now, what are the implications of that? And here we're using the concept of nature's contributions to people be equivalent to the concept of ecosystem services. And we evaluated 18 of such dimensions that goes from regulating service, as you see on the top, and then provisioning service and non-material service. And as I said, the picture is very sobering. Of all the strands, which we analyzed with all the best and most available indicators we could, only 4, and 3 in fact, but only 4 show signs of continuing increase. And the message here is very clear why. These are the dimensions that have a price to it. And are dimensions that are put value in terms of their material terms, at the expense of every other dimension that we depend on, that you see, in very significant decline around the world. Behind this picture, and that's a theme that I'm going to come back to a few times to situate then the Amazon and the implications for the Amazon as well, is that when you do an analysis like this at the global level, you can't forget that this is incredibly regionally differentiated, and I'll mention that several times. The distribution of the strands, the negative trends, are very unequal, both within groups of countries in terms of income level or development levels, but within countries, how those burdens are distributed within the population. That's one of the messages that came out very clear from the assessment, is the incredible, global and national injustice in distribution of the burdens and benefits of environmental change and degradation. And the other analysis that we did, of course, as part of that analysis is looking at indicators of environmental health globally. And again, all the indicators, or virtually almost all the indicators, are decreasing, from ecosystem extent and integrity, the size of population animals, of plants and animals, distinctiveness in ecological communities, of course, the number of species on Earth, and number of species threatened with extinction, and not least the number of local varieties and domesticated plants and so forth. So all the indicators that you look, again, with some regional variation, are globally in decline. We know the drivers of these processes, and that's one of the things that we're able to do is actually try to quantify the relative proportion of the causes of those changes on the ground. And here we have 2 concepts that we use: indirect drivers, or the underlying societal drivers, and the direct drivers, which here we are ranking in order of global impact. And not perhaps news to most of this audience, but land use change today continues across systems to be the most dominant driver. Direct exploitation and extraction of all kinds. Climate change already comes as the 3rd driver of ecosystem and biodiversity change in this case, followed by pollution and invasive species. When you look forward, many of these drivers continue to play a significant role regionally. For instance, in the global south, where land use, direct exploitation continue to be projected at a very high rate. But globally, actually, climate change is starting and projected to take, the first top spot in terms of driving of ecosystem and biodiversity change. What is interesting, and when I say that there's so many initiatives, so many reactions, to these problems in one way or another, and that's true. But what we have seen is that most of the actions that we take are directly to these direct drivers. They try to get, the forces that are, or try to address the forces that are happening directly on the change in the environment, but very few addressing the actually underlying causes, the societal values and institutions and governance systems, and of course the structure of the economy and supply chains, that actually create the conditions for this process to take shape. And that's part of also the story that we'll continue to talk in the Amazon. Now, to get to some of these structural issues, and I think some of really big part of this story that we tell in the global assessment. And I actually often I start a presentation about the global assessment with this figure, which is a figure of trajectories on several indicators, or few of the indicators that we use in the assessment across countries at different income groups. And I start, usually with this figure in many audiences to drive the point that what we see and what we observe in terms of environmental and social change and inequality and patterns of economic development have very long, very stable political economic roots. And if here it's be hard to go through in detail in the graph. The point that I want to drive here is the difference that you see in most cases in terms of the patterns that happen between the high-income countries, which I think in this case is mostly blue, the mid-income countries and the low-income countries, and how consistent those patterns are over time, and how consistent they continue to be. So one of the, first, there is it expresses a degree of acceleration in the scale of changes that we have been experiencing since the Second World War, but in this case, in particularly since the 1970s, where we have these kinds of figures: fourfold increase in global economy, tenfold increase in global trade, also increase in protected areas, globally, and also efforts to address pollution broadly, which is one of the figures that you see on the bottom here. And you can see the difference, in terms of the patterns and how persistent they are over time. What I think is most important is what are the implications of these trends? What are the outcomes of these trends in terms of development and societal distribution of benefits? And that's where I see, that are some of the key issues that needs addressing and that we need, to consider in this conversation. So one of the things that is really interesting is that how much economic growth, how unequal is the economic growth derived from different patterns of development. So when you look at, for instance, biodiversity decline or environmental degradation and the units of GDP that are gained per unit of degradation, you see a very clear pattern, which I'll come back to the very end of this presentation, of very extensive use of resources, high dependence on resource commodities, biomass and minerals for developing low-income and mid-income countries, with very high environmental costs, whether in terms of degradation or in terms of pollution, but a very small unit of GDP aggregation per unit of destruction. And I don't have the figure exactly now, but it's significant that the number of folds in which those kinds of pathways are converted to actually economic improvement, and then are converted in the distribution of economic improvements within countries. Second pattern that is behind this figure is, of course, the spatial segregation of production, extraction, and flow of goods, and where the values are aggregated and where the burdens stay and the burdens are suffered. So you have a very clear process that came across in the global assessment, is this increasing environmental displacement of burdens without the the economic benefits that would come or expected to come as such. So when you look across low-income countries and in particular middle-income countries, the value of natural capital as evaluated in some kinds of stocks is actually decreasing, but the economic development doesn't increase proportionally in terms of the benefits that it accrues. So this is a structural condition that I think persists and hasn't been as addressed. We see that, for instance, and we see the consequence of that in a region like the Amazon or where you see in Africa, right? So you look at just the issue of forest and forest restoration and forest conservation. And what we see globally is a moving frontier, and that moving frontier continues. So globally, there actually is stabilization of a declining forest. But that stabilization actually it actually benefits from expansion significantly in South America and in Africa. So that's where the frontiers where, that reflects the figures in this graph, where resource economies and resource dependent economies, are using natural resources, whether biomass or minerals or others, as their economic strategy. So this is a process that we know it's happening now. It's moving through the Amazon, it's moving to new areas as part of this global chain. What are the implications of that when we look more broadly? So we did an analysis of all the scenarios models available for a number of domains. This is a very synthetic summary here. And we compare groups of scenarios in terms of their assumptions in terms of economic growth, economic models, population, consumption, and so forth. So these three groups of scenarios that you see here: a business as usual kind of scenario, a regional competition, and a global sustainability scenario. And again, it's a very sobering message that I don't think is a surprise, but is very well documented in this case, which is when you look at just business as usual scenarios, continue how we continue today, and this group of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, we're basically missing 80% in the next 10 years, right? So the current trend that we have, we're not going to be able to meet any of the agreed goals, such as the SDGs, and actually make some of them unreachable or worse than we are currently. The other side of it, for those of you who are familiar with the International Biodiversity Agreement, the Aichi Biodiversity Target from the Convention of Biological Diversity, which is the last 10 years, and one of the big tests of the global assessment was to evaluate how much progress we have made in the Aichi target. And this is the figure that you have, right? Across the 20 targets, have mostly some success story, but it's considered in the conversation today, and it's being negotiated right now, as part of COP15 and the new agreement that's going to pave the ground for this coming decade. It has been considered a failure, in the sense of, as you see, the progress in most set of indicators have been poor. And then you have, of course, a number of moderate progress, which shows incredible variation across and within countries. So the message that comes, and the overall image, is that we're failing on all those aspects, at least at this level, and based on these indicators. And that's what I want to kind of start off, on this situation that is so dramatic. I don't even need to talk about the pandemic and how the pandemic actually is a long-term coming, and sort of just made exposed all these changes and their intersection as we see today. But I want to look a little bit beyond this narrative of crisis and the narrative of hopelessness that we tend to get when we sort of come across an analysis like this. And it's to look about where we're making progress, and what progress, and why, many aspects where we're making progress are not visible as they should be at least. So when one way is to interpret this figure as I just interpret, which you look in the narrative, that's what you're going to hear. We have failed in general. But another way to look at it is where have we made progress that is not showing up or that's not leading to enough of an emergent social norm or an emergent tipping point that would change one progress from from poor to good. And when we look closely and actually knowing this, what is behind these little signs there, there's an incredible amount of progress going on. Maybe enough at a level in which it changes things at a higher scale. But we see much more progress taking place in each one of those goals than setbacks, in fact. So, just looking here in terms of things that have advanced significantly for these particular goals, protected areas has not only significant, almost met the target set for this 10 years, but it has done so better in a way that indigenous populations, traditional communities have become a much stronger part of the governance of protected areas and actually gain land rights in many cases compared, for instance, to the previous 10 years of this target. Certification systems, management systems, awareness, national plans to deal with those issues. All those things have increased substantially in the past 10 years. The Nagoya Protocol is an example of advance that is now being implemented more and more and being sort of, becoming more of a reality after many years of negotiations. Efforts on restoration, protection of biodiversity, monitoring, an enormous amount of success stories in controlling invasive species. So these are efforts that are happening, close where people live and that are making a huge difference where people live, but tend, just like the ones that I'm going to show in the Amazon, tend to become invisible. In some cases, rightly so, in the case that you call attention to the larger problems, the larger drivers, but they tend to become invisible and not, I think, considering in the impact that they are having. I'm not going to lead, I'm just listing, I'm not going to read or go to these topics, but I want to provide examples of areas where there is significant advance taking place in management systems, in governance, in promoting cross-sectoral collaborations, a number of instruments that have been put forward and that are now sort of being implemented, and progress on many fronts, that are starting to emerge to deal with the intersection of all the issues that we are dealing with. One of the things we did in the global assessment, perhaps one of the most important contribution, or one of the most important contributions, was to systematically compile and look for evidence on the contributions of indigenous people and local communities to biodiversity and ecosystem conservation, management, and so forth, and for evidence on the drivers and the pressures that are affecting indigenous people and local communities. And so we end up putting together and being able to talk about those contributions at a global level. One evidence that has become apparent in a parallel work that provided support for the assessment was the scale of and the importance of indigenous lands, in this case, just indigenous lands, globally. And that itself helped to switch the conversation in platforms like EPBES or APCC or the CBD, who used to treat these kinds of interactions as very localized, issues that are very localized. And I think we're able to show the global implication of indigenous lands to these issues. And also that they are at the forefront of the pressures that are leading to the kinds of scenarios that I showed at the beginning. So it's actually about 20%, 28% of the global land are managed or held by indigenous populations. That represents close to 40% of the protected areas. The most conserved ecosystems globally, and where decline in those indicators that I showed before have been the slowest. Nonetheless, they are also declining. So we compile about 500 local indicators of change compiled by indigenous people and local communities, and we found that 72% of those indicators have some sign of decline. So that's the kind of, they're at the forefront of both the conservation and management and stewardship of resources, watersheds, agrobiodiversity, and the forefront of the pressures that are expanding around them. And you look at just what I said, the Aichi targets, the biodiversity targets for 2011 to 2020, and you look at progress in many of those targets, which are listing some here. I'm not going to go into detail again. These are progress that have emerged from the on-the-ground contribution of indigenous peoples and communities everywhere. And that's where they're making a difference. They're making a difference on the ground, but that's also where they're most threatened because it's where the pressures are taking place. But you look at progress in governance, progress in restoration, progress in controlling invasive species, and so forth. And this have, in monitoring, and it has, direct connection to efforts on the ground, in many cases by indigenous groups or local communities. That's the context that I want to set, more or less, to talk about, the efforts that I'm looking at with a bunch of collaborators in the Amazon. Of course, now a bit interrupted given the situation, but a project that has been really a source of hope and a source of, kind of energizing in the sense of recognizing and have the opportunity to see from the ground what people are doing to addressing their issues and transforming a region like the Amazon. So this is the project. The acronym is AGENTS, which is the most important part of the title. We first got the acronyms because we want to talk about people doing action, taking their own leadership on things. And then we found the name that would fit that. But the whole idea of agents is actually to look at the contribution of local initiatives, of individuals, of collective action on the ground that are not non-governmental initiatives, that people are doing, in many cases, in collaboration with government and organizations, but that they are taking on their own hands, right, and implementing and taking ownership of this initiative. So we are working across the region as a whole, but with 3 areas where we center attention. We work on the ground, and as you see here on the map. And what we are doing is implementing, and I'll talk a little bit more about the question. Now, here are the questions that we are kind of addressing in this project. I'll talk how we are addressing this project. So we are trying to understand, how these initiatives emerge, what makes them sustain, how do they transform landscapes and economic conditions, what factors, allow those initiatives to succeed, how the alliances and networks and collaboration across levels influence and affect and help initiatives to emerge and amplify, or in some case, to failures, depending on the initiative. What factors facilitate or not, they move forward and sustain themselves. And what we are trying to do is to look at initiatives that address multiple domains, right? So how they are kind of bringing together out of experience as well in working through different domains cross-sectorally, to leverage on each other to address several problems at the same time, from production to economic and markets to governance and institutions at the local level. And what we've been doing, and that has been one of the really interesting parts of this project, and I think very much relevant to your program, is we had this project, we define our goals, of course, to develop a proposal. but in a very open way, because it was the process of implementing the project that led us to define the specific goals that we want to approach. And that started very early in the project, really early, with a series of dialogue workshops, as we call them, in interactions with a diverse group of stakeholders in each one of those locations, to discuss what are the issues, to discuss what would be, in which way a project like this could help to take forward and to understand what they're doing on the ground. And that led us to define a series of specific questions, and also define where to work and how to work, and who to include and not. I'll give you an example. When we started this project, the idea in working these landscapes that are very diverse, the idea was to bring very diverse group of actors together, because they live side by side in the same landscape. That being the ranger, the local, a small scale farmer, Quilombola community, indigenous community. I mean, these are all sharing and interdependent on the same scale. And our initial idea was to start understanding their perspectives, but also develop participatory scenarios that would bring those different perspectives to the same landscape. It proved impossible. Just by the nature and the political nature and the conflictual nature of issues in Brazil, there's just not the environment that would allow a conversation, a productive conversation, to take place across groups who are situating themselves politically and economically in very distinct way. And we make very clear options about it, about who to work with and what activities to favor, and dedicate time to our questions and approach to that. So the way the project is organized, we have an aspect that is, a larger spatial aspect to it, both regionally and in each location, and a database that I'll talk about in a second. The other aspect of it is actually participatory work on the ground, both with groups of people representing leaderships from different groups, and also with specific families, communities, and so forth, where we do work. So these are the two kind of overarching aspects that we are trying to do. And here, I mean, one of what we want to do is this project is recognize and make these initiatives visible in a landscape where they are literally invisible at the regional level, and to policymakers and to the public as a whole. These are examples of outcomes that come from these kinds of workshops. These workshops are day long. And then they're followed by field activities and visit to those different places that in the last few weeks. And we start mapping and organizing initiatives, and I'll show in a second what kinds of initiatives, in this case, in the state of Pará. We also did that for the state of Acre. And that's followed by field work, where we go and visit each initiative. We usually spend a day, and that prepares for longer field work when we come back to actually stay longer time on the ground, which has been interrupted, unfortunately, for now. So we're doing a lot of actually virtual conference. We produce a lot of reports from these processes that we co-produce with the people who participated in the field. We take it back to them so they can look and read, and then we publish them, and that's part of the process of contributing to make those efforts very visible, documented, and available. So what we are working now is we have set up a database of 200 some initiatives that are in 900 localities and in 174 municipalities. And I would say this is just the surface of the kinds of initiatives that are taking place in the region. We are doing these virtual workshops. This is the group working in Peru. We've done about a dozen of those workshops with organizations. So we're trying to maintain those activities as the pandemic, has interrupted many things. And that's the kind of initiatives that we're looking at. So we are looking into place-based initiatives that have the people implementing them have the ownership of it, and they take the risks of implementing those initiatives. They have the governance of those initiatives. Although in most cases, they represent a process of interaction with external actors, either through the ideas or financial support or programs that allow people on the ground to start taking initiative. In other cases, it emerges completely from the ground up, from experiences that they share among themselves and start implementing. So we're looking at a number of production and environmental management related initiatives, which are fascinating, such as recovery of fallows. And then one thing that you see across many of these initiatives is a transition to agroforestry system, both as a means of improving economic conditions, as a means of recovering degraded environment or degraded pastures, and diversifying, an economy that has both a better market locally and also internationally and nationally. There are a number of community-based management initiatives that we look at, including the example here is forestry, a fantastic initiative of certified forest management by communities, employing hundreds of community members, and that also uses a high-end furniture that they sell. Lots of micro industry. This was one of the most fascinating parts for me. I've been writing a lot about the problem of value aggregation in the Amazon, and when you have very high, many of you who know me know my work on acai and the talking about the value of acai and how that value adds value proportionally to how far it moves from the region. So one of the fascinating aspects that I've seen in this project is the number of invisible micro industries, many of them, if not most of them, led by women, and sometimes without any kind of support. Like you see the examples on the bottom here of industries of fabric, of purses, of sandals, a lot of jewelry, umbrellas with this kind of modified rubber fabric thing. Fascinating kind of work that needs more attention. I mean, needs to be valued, needs to be shown, because these things are, in the context of the Amazon, very invisible. And that's how they distribute. So you can organize this initiatives in many different ways. Here's one way that we organize in terms of specific projects, cooperatives. There's a boom of small-scale cooperatives taking place, formation of associations, inter-associations, programs that are broader, farm system, micro-industry. So a number of areas in which we see these initiatives. But one of the things that we're really getting from it is how integrated they are with each other. And we're looking to them in a historical context. In what ways the experience and the process and the many interventions that has taken place in the Amazon have shaped these initiatives, and have created the conditions upon which they are now emerging. So we are kind of articulating this in terms of three big phases that have been very central in the region. Of course, the state developmentalism, frontier mentality, which started early, kind of went down, and then it's at its peak now again, unfortunately. What we call transnational social environmentalism, and the movement that is started, and the bundle of policies that came out of that. And more recently, this market-based corporate green schemes. And we also look into a number of what we call enabling or enablers, processes that have been behind this transformation of the region over 50, 60 years. The liberation theology movement, which I followed very much 30 years ago where I worked, and that really created first the sense of community and a sense of the actual idea of community and how the concept became a political unit. The PPG7 program, the program for the protection of rainforests, perhaps one of the most impactful program in Amazonian history. And social environmental policies, a bundle of social environmental policies that have allowed to emerge what has emerged today. I'm not going to go into that or into this, which means very specific series of programs that we are identifying that had that importance in creating the conditions upon which initiatives, place-based initiatives emerge. And you can see that over time. This is the distribution of the initiatives that we are looking at when they have emerged. And you see, as part of this process of learning, experimenting, failing, and reorganizing yourself over time. So I'm just here, I'm not going to stop because of the time. I'm just going to go over so you have a sense of how those things look. Many agroforestry and consortium agriculture and community nurseries, which we found there are like over almost 200 of such nurseries today. Recovery of pastures and converting pastures into agroforestry systems. Same here, implementing various kinds of agroforestry and fallow recovery. A new generation coming back. There's really interesting examples of a young generation that have been trained in these kinds of rural schools and are now implementing these new ideas of agroforestry. The agroforest on top here is less than 5 years old, for instance. This was a fallow that used to be, a manioc cultivation area. All sorts of beekeeping and fallow management. And as cooperatives and fruit processing for value aggregation, we also find many of such areas for certification and high value furniture to aggregate value in forest products, the kind of micro industries that I showed before that deal with slacks and oils and all sorts of non-timber forests. Associations, this is a fascinating women's association called Amabella. And these associations are incredible. They play a role in production, in home gardens, empowering women within their own families and more broadly in creating this kind of direct marketing, as you see on the car here, that they use to sell their products together. A lot of failure projects that we look at their history and how now they are overcoming and learning from that experience. And in general, what is interesting is that very different from what I have seen in the past, where a project or initiative would be either a production one or a value aggregation one or dealing with some kind of management plan or some governance arrangement. Today, those initiatives tend to have all three components. Right, and seek interactions because they know the shortcomings and I've seen many of families who have produced an incredible agricultural crops that they couldn't sell or that the value wouldn't even pay for the cost that they had. So that's a very interesting process, how they are articulating these initiatives across different domains. Now, to get to a close, this is one of the maps that we produce of the database. And what comes across is that they are small, but they are many. So that's one, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. They are everywhere, right? And they have this great leverage potential, to create changes that matter to people and that progressively may be having an impact more regional. There are examples of initiatives. This is of course, my own work on acai, and acai is an example where it's a bottom-up, intensification of agroforestry in response to market, and so that led to this global product, and that has spread and shows the scaling up potential of an activity that did not have any external coordination, but has transformed entire landscapes in the region. You see the emergence of middle-scale agroforestry, very, very profitable in this case, which this is one of my favorite pictures because you have this incredible agroforest in the back, which looks like a forest in front of a pasture. And if you compare the rentability of those two, it's just, it kind of, it makes naked, the difference that they make in the Amazon in terms, not only environmentally, but in terms of profitability. And even compared to the larger commodities, let's say meat and soy, if you just look at acai, Brazil note, cacao, their contribution, is sort of half of those commodities, and they occupy 60 times less of an area, and with a much stronger, social impact. So I think we're in that phase of starting to understand and appreciate the potential of this kinds of process. To conclude, I want to, very briefly talk about two big things, but we can continue about that. Initiatives, collective action, even in one community, is difficult. It's very, very difficult. I'm just putting here in celebration of Governing the Commons 30th anniversary, some of the factors that Lynn Ostrom helped us to appreciate of how difficult it is to engender these kinds of collective action. But on top of that, you have all these other processes interfering, all sorts of elite capture in the Amazon, cartels, and internally self-interest, cooperation, or free riding, all these problems that they have to deal on a daily basis, to keep those initiatives going. But today, in the context of the Amazon, in addition to a pandemic that has been mishandled worse than anywhere in the world, in Brazil, and even worse in the Amazon, you have these other pressures coming place, infringement of rights, the frontier expansion, lack of law enforcement, cartels that have become empowered, and the denialism and conspiracy and so forth. So it's a moment where, you really, and that's what I said, you have this dissonant reality of having so much hope and see so many things going on, and at the same time, seeing so much pressure, and so many things that are pressing at this time, the people that I just showed to you. I want to conclude with a very high level generalization. It's a very difficult graph to interpret, but it relates to the first graph that I show in terms of development pathways and inequality in development pathways. And what this figure shows from the global assessment, that you have two patterns of development that have been emerged during this many decades. One for more high-income countries where you had, of course, significant environmental degradation, but over time, you start to revert those degradations significantly while maintaining GDP growth, maintaining economic growth, because you have an export of those burdens to lower income countries, where you continue to have environmental degradation, but at a very small level of aggregating GDP, right? So the challenge, that's a challenge that is a structural challenge. It's a challenge in which doesn't matter what those communities do or where, any other group do, it is structured in an unequal market. And that becomes, I think, the options that we have in a post-pandemic, rethinking of development pathways. Whether we can revert this curve from degradation, to reverting environmental problems while gaining some economic growth in some way by, for instance, increasing value aggregation and many other issues, or whether it continues the process that we now have and that we now see migrating to other regions of the world very fast, of increasing degradation, of this narrative of commodity economies that aggregate very little resources and very unequal resources to those outcomes. So I don't think place-based initiatives are a panacea at all, of course, but they're gaining important, they're confronting pressures, they're finding new ways to mobilize. I think the COVID pandemic made it very clear that in spite of all the limitations, these are the people most affected. They have reorganized themselves to confront and to avoid further catastrophe. But they depend on higher level institutions. There's not a single level for governing a region like the Amazon or any other place, right? These are regions that depend on that cross-level interaction. So it's a difficult time. It's also a time of hope. I think, when we see and when we make and recognize the potential of these kinds of efforts that we see everywhere. So I'll stop here. Thank you. And sorry if I, went too long.
Thank you, Dr. Brondizio. Nope, we are still technically in the time limit. And if people would like to spend a little bit more time into the break to further discuss some aspects, I'm sure that would be okay. And so thank you again for joining us today and celebrating ICON's 10th anniversary, and for really bringing into discussion these dynamics of local initiatives and how they're related to actions on the ground, but then also larger global structural processes and challenges. And so now we're going to open the virtual floor to questions. For anyone who has a question, please use the chat only. And to help us introduce you to Dr. Brondizio, please include your name and affiliation. So if you're from geography or anthropology. And once we're done with the Q&A here, we'll have a Zoom break before coming back together at 2:45 for our 10th anniversary celebration session and then alumni panel. And so please feel free to type your questions into the chat. And as we wait for questions, because typing can take a little while, I'll start off with a question about this idea of visibility of these local initiatives. And so you've mentioned the importance of bringing visibility to how people on the ground, particularly, for example, micro industries by women, and how visibility is important or helpful. And I was wondering if you could reflect on what the potential benefits are and what the potential downsides of bringing visibility to small scale local initiatives could be.
Great question. So, I mean, there is a, let me see how I put this. During the past few years, and I just don't want to say the Bolsonaro government, because this has been building on for several years. You have a strengthening of the developmentalist mentality and the devaluing of forests, and of course the valorization of the large commodities for the Brazilian economy, the great success stories, and all those stories are cast, in the context of usually invisibilizing or disregarding what is taking place on the ground and the value of those local economies to the regional economy. So we look at, the contribution of smallholders to the economy of the Amazon or the Brazil as a whole. The first time we start to get data on that,
for everyone else, is Dr. Brondizio's screen frozen? Yeah, Bruno. As means that yes, he's frozen. Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Okay, so let's see if he can come back. And then in the meantime, so we have a couple minutes till 2:30. Please do feel free to stick around for a little. And Brian, we will definitely get to your question. If not currently at the talk, we can follow up with Dr. Brondizio in an email and just sort of continue the virtual conversation in a different mode. And now he's gone. So let's wait around for a second or two. Make sure.
Well, I'm just saying he might just be trying again and allocate.
Yeah. But everyone who did receive their cookie, make sure to bring it to the 10th anniversary celebration, which is our next session at 2:45. If you have not already enjoyed it, which you had instructions not to until after. Look at Nate's screen. He's in a forest of icon cookies.
He knows how to do it.
Yeah, so let's see. I'll try to email him maybe. Oh, he's back and he's a co-host again. Welcome. Oh, now you're on mute.
I don't know what happened. Yeah, my computer restarted, in fact.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, the whole system restarted suddenly. So, okay, visibility. To be short, let me give you one example, okay? Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll give you one example that I think helps to say that. In the area where you saw those photos of micro-industry, the forest certification program, some of those agroforestry, that happens within a national forest community kind of sustainable reserve, okay? Next to it, there are soybean fields and cattle ranching. So the mayor of that municipality tends to refer and contrast those two activities as, look into that, there's nothing going on there. You know, it's a bunch of forest that is not allowing us to maintain the development of the municipality, as he points to the soybean and to the cattle ranching. Inside that reserve are happening, the activities that I show. That's where I saw, the most people employed, the most generating, money from resource management, the most amount of youth engaged in economic activities. But they are framed within this narrative of invisibility or lack of contribution to the region, and those narratives remain visible. So, and that, I think, across the Amazon is the narrative that I think we need to confront. We really need to show the value, the contribution in many dimensions, in the environmental domain, in economic domain, and not least in terms of employment, and how much they contribute to employment and to food production that is actually consumed locally. So,
well, thank you for that answer. That was great. And if you are okay with it, we have two questions that are very interrelated. And so Brian Crawford, who's an ICON alum, and Akanksha, who's an ICON ecology student, both are asking more about the local initiatives and factors that influence, one, the longevity of these initiatives. So you mentioned both the success stories and some of those failures. And then also related to this longevity, how the place-based initiatives organize between and among themselves, and how they may establish connections, share knowledge, or maintain long-term relationships.
A great question. That's the types of questions we're trying to respond in the project. So, very partial answer. I think we learned a lot from the work of Lynn Oster in terms of, if you look at the design principles, right? And what conditions allow communities to succeed in their effort, from boundaries to type of collective governance, to monitoring, to conflict resolution mechanisms. And so we know a lot about those processes. However, those were developed and studied under conditions of no external influence. And actually, Lynn Oster in Governing the Commons control for, the external factors that would affect the success of local activities, which is not the reality in which all those communities live. So in addition to those issues, there were well-known conditions that help those communities to succeed. I think there are a number of things that we are learning in this process. Learning from failures. That's a huge part of how they are succeeding now, because in the past, they were subjected to a lot of subsidies and to what I call, the pilot project syndrome. So that kind of, very colonial, so to speak, projects, right? That bring the idea, bring the money, bring the goals, and communities implement because, there's some on it for at least for some time. And I think now you have a much stronger political consciousness, political voice, where the goals are defined more locally, and that helps to maintain the process. The ownership of the initiative is much more local, and I think that or when they are more local helps to define. The partnerships, and partnerships here between them, so to form alliances, networks, to collaborate and to share experiences, which we see expanding quite a bit because of social media and in other ways as well. In partnerships with external actors, that allow them to leverage more voice, more political power, and more resources. So it's a number of conditions that I think we are learning that help them to succeed.
Thank you.
And many others that I probably forgot.
And if there is time, are you set to answer another question?
Oh, Eddie,
I'm this one comes from Nate Niblink, who is professor in forestry and natural resources and very important for the ICON program. So he writes, you mentioned that the important questions or problems to address in this work were, quote, to be developed with other people or groups who are not yet involved. Did this pose any challenges for acquiring funding? Also, how does the involvement of local groups in publishing affect, quote, traditional academic productivity?
That's a great question, Nate, if I may, for you, Nate. Really great question. And I can actually contrast two projects on that. This project was developed under a program called Transformation to Sustainability, which is a program within the Belmont Forum North Face International Funding Network. The program in itself, developed a call in a framework that was inducive for us to do a participatory bottom-up project. So the nature of that proposal allowed us to build a larger question that would guide us and to build the kinds of more academic questions that I mentioned at the beginning and that was just asked, but also to allow a project to be participatory from the beginning and then define where exactly we're going to work, what specific question we're going to focus on to be developed during that first year. And that's why we put the whole emphasis on the first year. On the one hand, setting up a platform or the things that the data and so forth, and spend time in the field, investing time on these conversations. And from that conversation, define where to go. So you're right. I mean, the program helped. I have another project starting from a CNA GNSF grant, also on community-based management of fisheries. But the proposal is completely structured. We have every step of the way structured, mapped, model, so a proposal of very different nature. I think we're going to learn a lot about when you are in the field and probably reassess some of the proposal, but because of the nature of the funding and the proposal, we had to do a very traditional kind of research design from the beginning and forward. In terms of publication, that's not a concern that I'll have in terms of the nature of the publication. I think our goal in this project, which was a bit interrupted now, is actually to work and to pass the material to the local collaborators and to the regional collaborators, particularly those who are in regional universities and research institutes, and really pass the stuff to them and work with them on this process. The reports allow us to bring the community members as co-authors, and so that is a format that helps a lot, to integrate people from various backgrounds in producing the same product.
Great, thank you so much.